convergence of technology and personality resides a select group of individuals. Those individuals are known as technologists, and they put their thoughts on the line for you.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you might be. You're joining us in a very unique and somewhat different approach to our podcast. We're actually doing a video element to the podcast this time around, and we're going to add a little more flair, I would assume, from that perspective, since now you can see us instead of just hearing us. But just to introduce the both of us, myself, I'm John Hildebrand, Principal Technologist here at Cohesity.
And my name's Theresa Miller, Director of Technical Advocacy at Cohesity.
And you're listening to another special edition of On the Line with Cohesity, as once again, we go through and try to add video elements into our equation. But let's talk about the year that was, Theresa, and let's talk about 2022, the year that we started to get back together again as far as events are concerned. We started to see each other again, evident by the fact we were all at AWS reInvent, and we got to see 50,000 plus people for the first time in quite some time. That was wild compared to last year when it was only 20,000 people. So I guess let's start off with a little bit of discussion about where things are going, especially from a hybrid cloud perspective. I think you've got a little bit to say on this particular topic.
Yeah, so when I think about 2022 and cloud and hybrid cloud, I don't think we're seeing a stall when it comes to adoption. Organizations continue to take advantage of cloud services so that they're not managing that infrastructure. I think it adds complexity to environments, though. So not only are they choosing one cloud, they might choose multiple clouds or even SaaS. And so that is potentially causing a disconnect in data and the knowledge behind what they have. So I think while it's exciting and full steam ahead on the cloud side, I think that is a point of concern that I have as we move forward into the future here.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, one of our messages that we have from a Cohesity perspective definitely is the fact that with each one of those clouds in a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment, you're talking about different buckets of data that you're accumulating, and it gets back to the mass data fragmentation argument that we have from a company perspective. So it does make sense that we would want to ensure that your data being accumulated across all these different endpoints is managed in some capacity, so that you can know exactly what it's doing. Because if you don't know what's out there, you don't know what the impacts are going to be in the event that you lose that data. Especially when it comes to either whether it's innocuous or whether it's actually malicious in intent with losing that particular subset of data.
Yeah, that's true. I think the other thing that, as I look back on the last year, I think that organizations are starting to understand that their data is their data and that they do have some level of responsibility. I think that is improving. But I think we'll keep an eye on it as well. We'll see what next year brings to see if it continues to improve.
Not that you're going to drop a little juicy tidbit for later on when we get into predictions, but it sounds like you're alluding to 2023 in the year that is forthcoming. So, do we have anything else from a hybrid cloud perspective? I know that you mentioned SaaS as an example inside of there as well, and I know a lot of organizations are tending to adopt SaaS moving forward. And being able to protect that subset of data, knowing full well that we're talking about what is the shared responsibility model when it comes to these particular services that we consume out there, I think we're going to see a lot more, hopefully, organizations realizing what they need to protect versus
Mhm.
what they believe they may be getting from the service
Mhm.
individually. So I think from a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud SaaS perspective, I think that full understanding of what exactly the shared responsibility model is something that definitely is something that I'm hoping that more and more organizations are taking a closer look at and realizing what they have to protect themselves versus what, again, the organizer of the services may actually be providing in that regard.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, beyond the shared responsibility model, I think when I look back at this year, I think people are still learning that a lot of those services don't have recovery SLAs either. So not only do they have an actual backup, or in some cases they might, but most of the time they don't. You have to take the extra step to do something, but the recovery SLA isn't guaranteed. So something to think on, and probably actually do something about. If you're listening in and didn't realize that, you might want to do some data recovery testing to see exactly how long it'd take to get your data back, because um, there are larger issues out there. I'm going to segue us to our next topic, John, and that's security. Security vulnerabilities are a larger threat than what we used to protect our environments from a DR perspective. Things like natural disasters, for example. Security threats are real and happen more than I think we realize. So, what are your thoughts, John, on the security side of things as we look back at last year?
Well, we saw a definite degradation of, if you want to call it, the amount of folks that were being impacted from ransomware, as an example. We natural disasters happen. You have to do testing every once in a while to test your capabilities, but ransomware became worse and worse as the year went on. And I believe that, from kind of an extra prediction from a 2023 perspective, it's definitely going to be top of mind from organizations across the board, from IT ops to the boardroom of organizations, that they're going to have to deal with this scourge at some particular point. It's cliched now at this juncture, but it's not a question of if, it's a question of when your organization is going to have to be tested in this regard. So I think what we're seeing definitely is a decrease in the amount of those amount of seconds an organization is impacted. I think we're down now to every 2 seconds some organization is impacted, whether it's an individual device, an individual server, or just a broader scope ransomware attack that happens. We're down to 2 seconds now that an organization is being impacted. In the past, it was 5 seconds, 11 seconds. Now we're down to 2 seconds. It's a very lucrative opportunity for criminal organizations, and they're going to continue to do this until we end up, from a business perspective, do something about it to limit the impact that these particular events happen to have on our particular organizations.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because it does seem that every stolen record has a dollar sign attached to it that the thief can then collect some money on. So in essence, this is almost like the new bank robbery.
It, it is, and I've been hearing, especially from certain other industry segments, that with exfiltration now as part of the overall attack vector that happens, so stealing
Mhm.
the data before encrypting the data, now we're getting to the point where, if there was a lot of personal information in that data, now somebody has some information about an individual that they can target now at the same time as they're targeting an organization. So it's kind of a ripple effect of who they can potentially go after in regards to whether or not they want this information publicly released, or because we all know reputation is king when it comes to organizations and individuals. So the last thing that those organizations and individuals are going to want is their reputation damaged beyond repair. So now you're getting a ripple effect, not just the initial attack vector of being able to, say, encrypt data, but now what can I do with that particular subset of data and go after individuals or other organizations that are working with that particular initially attacked organization.
Yeah, so I guess that makes me think about some of the customer stories that we've been hearing about. I know you and I have had the opportunity to actually even speak and present with some of these companies. I don't know, is there anything that you would want to kick off with maybe when because I know I have some stuff too, but would love to hear what you've been learning from our customers on this front.
Well, we're coming to know that the attacks can come from anywhere, and that's it. Literally, in the case of one customer that I worked with for a presentation, it all started with an email phishing attack,
Mm.
and it was to somebody's personal email on top of it. It wasn't even to a corporate email server in that regard. It was to somebody else's Gmail account. And it brought in a link to go to click on, and somebody brought the attack into the organization at that point. And then essentially, for all intents and purposes, all hell broke loose and caused things to basically malfunction across the board. And in this particular case, when you're a healthcare organization, you've got patient lives at stake just from the day-to-day operations perspective. And having that impacted, or I believe you've worked in healthcare beforehand, if you've ever heard the term we have to go back to paper, something's wrong. And the organization had to go back to paper for essentially 23 days to be able to recover. And we were able to help, Cohesity was able to help them recover, but they had to do forensics. They had to do all sorts of other, what sort of the impact was, what sort of data, if there was any data exfiltrated. They had to do all of this lookup and process and procedure to get through, just to be able to determine what as we call it, the blast radius was from the attack, to know exactly what they were dealing with. And it all started with a single email. That's scary.
That is, but it's interesting. I was doing some research on this recently because these stats change all the time. And one of the things that I learned is that 65% of basically the cyber attackers leverage email, and it's specifically email phishing. So there's a pretty high risk, I would say, or pretty high probability that email is going to be the way that the breach occurred. I mean, it's not the only way, but that's pretty significant.
Yeah. And especially since everybody's got an email address. And in this particular case, it was a personal email address on top of it. So I know as we get to the point, corporate policies may start to restrict personal access to things outside of the organization. And while that may impact us from the ability to do other things while we're on the job, it's definitely something that's going to protect the organization overall, is being able to clamp down on what individuals can and can't do from a desktop perspective, as an example.
Yeah, I've worked in organizations where they tried to be very restrictive on that stuff, and people had a really hard time with it, which is interesting because should people really be doing personal stuff on their corporate devices? Probably not. So, and I think in this day and age, most people have their own personal device with them anyways. So I'm in favor of locking down things to a certain degree, right? Still gotta be able to do your job, but
Yeah,
Gmail, I could live without that on a corporate device.
yeah, that's why individuals will issue corporate mandated devices to use, like
Mhm.
even from a Cohesity perspective.
Mhm.
My Cohesity laptop is done for Cohesity business, and that's it. I've got plenty of
Mhm.
other devices to use for personal things, for
Right.
example. So it's just the way that I operate, and hopefully in the future, more folks will operate with that same sort of mindset instead of trying to do everything with a single device.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing that kind of struck a chord with me, so when I think about, um, so one of the customers that I spoke with recently, we talked about the fact that, so again, well, this was a little different, right? It was stolen credentials. Um, and the credentials weren't, it was actually personal credentials that were stolen when they started, when they did the research on this after the fact. But the password that was being used was the same as for the work. So, to me, that tells me how much effort these these attackers will put into being, even the creativity behind that, right? To map the personal with the work, try the password on the work where maybe more of the value is to the attacker, and then leverage it to take systems down. But the other piece that really struck me, John, is you mentioned paper. In multiple cases, I've heard of organizations going back to paper to be able to keep their business online. Like, that can't work for every organization. And, for you and me who have sat in the infrastructure space and done architecture around DR, I never once sat down and said, I'm going to architect for paper as like plan what C. So that's been really eye opening for me to hear as well.
Yeah, it's definitely something when we start to think about either active passive or active active designs, the last thing we're starting to worry about is whether the printers are going to be able to print the certain things necessary, or whether or not we're going to have to worry about handwritten notes to be able to get jobs done around the organization. So
Yeah.
it's definitely something we don't plan for, but in in my particular case with the customer that I worked with on this, that they had to go to that route, and it ended up having it. I mean, they had to do what they had to do to keep the business going, and
Mhm.
it was definitely not planned for, but they know how to essentially operate in a worst case scenario, which
Yeah.
you hope organizations don't have to pull the plug on the worst case scenario, but just on the safe side, during testing procedures, you may have to plan for a complete system outage. And what would you do from a DR, disaster recovery, or even a business continuity perspective, just to be able to keep the business afloat in the event that you don't have IT systems to help you?
Yeah, and I have one more example. So we had a customer now. They're a customer now. They weren't at the time, doing a POC of our solution with their data. And at the time of the POC, they were attacked by ransomware. The ransomware took down their primary and secondary data copies, which were all they had. And it was actually any data that was stored on Cohesity, they were able to recover. So when I think about that, like data loss, like, so if they didn't have our POC, they might have gone out of business for one. And they're and maybe by some strange card of luck, they didn't go out of business. There definitely would have been some jobs lost. And so I feel pretty thankful that they had our solution in the POC state to recover, because I don't know what they would have done.
No, that's definitely an opportune gotcha. Basically, a very good opportunity at that point to be able to showcase the solution. But as far as timing was concerned, the timing couldn't have been much worse and couldn't have been much better in that
Mhm.
particular regard, to at least showcase what Cohesity was able to able to do for that organization. But as you mentioned, if they were in the midst of a POC, may not have been all the data necessary that they would have had to go through. So they would have had to probably rebuild some systems on top of it to be able to do the full breadth of the recovery at that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, why don't we segue a little bit into 2023? We alluded to it earlier with some juicy tidbits about what we believe the future might hold for us. So what do we have for predictions for 2023? Theresa, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I think for me, my prediction wraps around both cloud and security. I think that we're going to continue to see both be relevant. Um, when I consider remote work, I mean, I know some organizations have pulled their people back to the office, but a lot of organizations are allowing employee choice. And so cloud is a really great fit for managing and offering workloads to remote teams, and then, be on heightened security alert and have the right tools implemented to be able to be successful. So that's my prediction.
Well, and I'll flip the script a little bit. There seems to be a little bit of a perception that a lot of us in the data protection and the data management space are trying to convert ourselves into data security companies. And while the Venn diagram of what we're actually trying to do touches into security, we're not necessarily trying to become security companies per se. That the prime example that I've got is, especially for 2023, is our recently released information about DataHawk and what we're doing there to help organizations to improve their security posture overall. We're not necessarily trying to be the company that does the scanning. We're the company that houses the data. But we're trying to be that spot where you can utilize your best of breed third parties and scan that data on behalf of that particular organization using those tools that you want to use, that your SecOps team wants to use, and trying to bridge gaps between IT ops and SecOps to try to shortcut and get to resolution faster when it comes to overall organization security posture. So I think what you're going to see in 2023 is a continued focus on the security aspect from what you would consider your data protection and your data management spaces. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're all trying to become security companies. That just means we're just trying to work and help in that space, knowing full well that we house that data and it's the best place to possibly get those insights out of the data that can help determine with things like classifying the data and being able to do threat detection, and to be able to also do what we do with Fort Knox as an example, being able to vault that particular data in a third party location that rivals tape in that regard. So we're all making that push, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're all necessarily trying to become security companies in that regard. So keep a lookout in 2023 as you start to hear more from this particular space and realize that we're not all just immediately flagging ourselves as security companies. We're trying to help in that particular space. That's all. So with that, I think we've done our predictions. We're at the closing of this particular episode. I'd like to thank Theresa once again. Always nice to have you on the podcast.
Yeah.
And and thank the whole entire breadth of the TAG team. You've heard us all over the course of the year, and hopefully we continue to provide you good insights, some entertainment every once in a while. I know once in a while we like to joke around and have some fun, and just keep on keeping on when it comes to data management and data protection in the spaces that we have to deal with. It's a crazy world out there, and we're just trying to provide some levity into it. So looking forward to an active 2023 with all of you, and thanks for listening, and continue to follow us along on your standard podcast locations, whether that's Spotify, Apple, And I think we're on Google nowadays, if I'm not mistaken.
We are, yep. So, yep, and I think you said YouTube. So yeah, now we're all
Oh,
over.
oh yeah, I forget. Now that we're doing the video side, follow us on YouTube so you can see our lovely faces that goes with the audio at the same time.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks once again, and have a good rest of your 2022 and a positive 2023. Thanks.